Hello everyone, welcome to the Controversial Canadians with Timothy and Caleb. Today we'll be discussing World War II and whether or not the United States should have been involved. Timothy, what is your viewpoint on this topic?
The United States did not need to get involved in the Second World War. First of all, governments on all sides were committing mass murder, and also, I think that the United States government could have avoided the Pearl Harbor attack if they spent more time considering the consequences of their foreign policy decisions beforehand. And finally, I think that the Allies could easily have won without American help.
All right, well, that's quite the interesting point of view. Gotta say, I disagree with you there, Timothy. Well, there's always going to be bad people on both sides, and for instance, the Soviet Union was very corrupt and was murdering millions as well. Well, they were dealt with afterwards, and it was just a temporary coalition to remove the biggest threat at hand in the moment. Alright, so back to your first point that the Allies had bad countries on their side. Where's your statistics behind this? Where's the information?
Many will argue that the United States government needed to get involved in World War II because Hitler was a mass murderer and that he had killed 6 million Jews by the war's end. However, if you look at the murders that were committed by both the Allied and Axis powers, it's shockingly not that different. Rudolf J. Rummel was a professor of political science, and he conducted extensive research into the number of non-combatants killed by governments during the 20th century, and compiled the data into a book titled Death by Government. Here are the statistics he found. Now keep in mind that all of these numbers of people, these are people who were killed by governments, not by warfare. On the Axis side, during World War II, Nazi Germany killed 21 million people. Now, this number is much higher than just the 6 million Jews which we commonly think of. In addition to the Jews, the Nazis also killed prisoners of war, the aged, the sick, homosexuals, Slavs, Serbs, Czechs, Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, and political opponents. Imperial Japan also killed approximately 6 million people. Most of them Chinese, and also they killed many prisoners of war. Now on the Allied side, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin killed approximately 43 million people. Joseph Stalin was the worst murderer on the Allied side. However, in Asia, the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-Shek, leader of the Kuomintang government in China, killed over 10 million of his own citizens. The grand total of the two worst governments of the Axis and the Allies are as follows. Grand total for Axis, about 27 million. Grand total for Allies, about 53 million. Now remember, we're not counting the French or the British governments and the people that were killed by them in the building of their empires. In light of these statistics, I would argue that the United States didn't need to get involved because both sides were committing mass murder against their own populations and people of other races. I don't see any justification for the U.S. military support to these countries.
I agree with you there. The Nazis, Japan, the USSR, China, all horrible nations that just murdered millions and millions. However, I don't think that the USSR or China were bent on world domination, at least at that moment in time. The U.S. dealt with the USSR after. I mean, what was the Cold War all about? Stalin died in 1956. It was just about dealing with what was the immediate threat at the time, what was threatening the status quo. So what are your thoughts on my argument there, Timothy?
Well, I don't know about China, but if you look at how much land the USSR occupied, they controlled 16% of the Earth's surface, whereas Germany, at its height, only controlled about 4%. In light of those numbers, wouldn't you have to agree that Russia was in much more danger of taking over the world than Germany?
Canada takes up more space than Germany, but we say that Canada was threatening to the world as Germany. And I'm very sure with how Stalin was that he had a goal of domination. It's just that the immediate threat was Germany with how quickly it was taking over country after country after country.
Now, Caleb, you know that the Red Army in Russia was very large and was threatening other countries. They invaded part of Poland at the same time Hitler did, actually. They also invaded Finland in, I think, the winter of 1939, 1940. I can't remember. They also invaded Latvia and those Baltic states there. So I cannot agree with you on that. And Canada did not have an army anything like the Red Army.
That was a well-made point there. I'll have to concede you that victory, especially as we don't want to drag this out and take too much time with the debate here. So now moving on to the second point you made there, Timothy, at the beginning with your outline of your viewpoint would be that the U.S. could have avoided the Pearl Harbor attack. Could you just go a bit more in detail there for us and give a solid argument to that point?
Based on my analysis of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States' entry into World War II, I think if you look at the events leading up to Pearl Harbor, that the U.S. government could have made different foreign policy decisions to avoid the Japanese attack. Before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan heavily relied on imports from the United States. They imported almost all of their oil from the U.S. Now keep in mind, Japan is an island nation. Because Japan was an island nation, they relied on ships to bring in goods from other countries. Without American oil, the Japanese economy simply couldn't function. And I'm not talking about just their war machine that they had going there. This is affecting everyday life. Shortly before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government had cut off all trade with Japan and made it impossible for their economy to continue running. I would argue that if this had not been done, then the Japanese would not have attacked Pearl Harbor. The economy of the United States was 10 times bigger than that of Japan. There was no way Japan could win a war against the United States by fighting them. What was the Japanese government supposed to do? They had two options. They could run to Uncle Sam and beg for mercy, or they could fight the U.S. government, or try to steal oil from the British in the Dutch East Indies, which the Japanese government feared would also bring the U.S. into the war. Now, many will argue that the U.S. embargo was necessary because of Japan's atrocities that were committed in China. However, as I've just pointed out, the Chinese government was killing even more Chinese people than the Japanese were. So I think both governments were rogues, and the United States didn't need to pick favorites here. What do you think, Caleb?
Yeah, totally. Really well made point there, Timothy. People often think that wars are so one-sided, but they need to realize that there's bad on both sides and that the U.S. needs to treat people with respect, and they obviously weren't through their foreign policy by showing better treatment to China than Japan when China was actually worse than Japan was in the moment. So now I'd like to move on to the last point you made at the start, that Russia and Britain could have defeated Germany without the States. I agree with you on that. However, at the same time, it was still made much easier with the States' involvement. My number one concern here is what is going to minimize the amount of civilian casualties. So I'd just like your thought on that, how the States staying out of it, could that have helped to minimize the casualties that occurred?
I believe that Russia and Great Britain and the other allies could easily have defeated Germany and Japan without American aid. Now, of course, the allies wanted help from the U.S. After all, if one is in a fight, he wants all the help he can get. But did they really need it? Richard Avery wrote a book titled Why the Allies Won, and he compiled many statistics on the economies of the combatants in the Second World War. Here are the statistics on weapons production during the Second World War, which Mr. Avery compiled. Now, for aircraft, Germany produced 30,000 aircraft in the years 1939 to 1941. In that same time period, the USSR and Britain produced 79,000. For tanks, Germany produced 8,700, whereas the USSR and Britain combined produced a total of 19,500. Also, for artillery, Germany produced 14,000 pieces of artillery, whereas the USSR and Britain produced 83,500 approximately. Now keep in mind, this is just the USSR and Britain. This doesn't even include all the many other Allied powers. Also, Germany and Japan possessed few natural resources. Germany and Japan had to import nearly all of their oil. In fact, Germany was beginning to run out of oil as early as 1942. The reason why Germany was able to win all the great victories in France and Scandinavia and Poland was because of oil imports from the Soviet Union. Once Germany invaded the Soviet Union, these supplies stopped, and Germany started to run out of oil. As a matter of fact, the Axis controlled 3% of the world's oil, whereas the Allies controlled 90% of it. A wartime economy can simply not survive without large amounts of oil. Without oil, there's no fuel for planes, tanks, or warships. Without oil, an army is doomed. I think that the Allies could easily have won without US help. And you talked about the need to reduce civilian casualties. I agree that the US involvement in World War II may have saved some civilian casualties. However, as we've already mentioned, the governments of most of these countries were rogues and ruled by petty tyrants, such as Stalin and Chiang Kai-Shek. And the US supported these governments. So when these governments won, what were they going to do? Were they really going to clean up their act?
Well, that was really well clarified and made point. Had such a great time discussing this with you today, Timothy. That's about all the time we had, so.
And hey, let us know if you would like to hear more debates from us. We love to do them.
If you want to see more debates like this, just comment ideas, topics. We're willing to take any ideas into consideration here. Also, just interested, would you guys like this to stay a podcast, or would you rather see video? We want to shape it around you, the viewers, and what you want. This has been the Controversial Canadians. Thank you so much for listening.